The question is that the motion be agreed to. Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, this bill, which imposes on local government the strictures of the State Service Commissioner, is a desperate attempt by the Labour opposition to play catch-up on the necessary reform that needs to take place within local government. You see, there is quite deep concern across New Zealand about the cost of rates, about the huge increases that have occurred over the last decade, and the people of New Zealand are looking for a government that will show leadership around addressing that issue. In March this year, the government announced a comprehensive package of reform to deal with the challenges within local government. And Labour, who has not only been opposed to those reforms, has suddenly woken up to the fact that they're on the wrong side of the public argument and has desperately pulled out of this drawer this bill and trying to get into the public discussion around costs within local government. But the first challenge I have for members opposite is they need to be accountable for their record in government around the increase in rates and their reforms. You see, in 2002, Labour put in place the biggest changes in many decades in local government laws. We rewrote the Local Government Act, they rewrote the Rating Powers Act and the Local Electoral Act. Members on this side of the House said that that was going to be a very costly reform. We warned them not to embark down that path. And members opposite, members of the Labour government of the time, assured New Zealanders that there would be no spike or increase in rates arising from those reforms. Exactly the opposite occurred. What we saw post-2002, and it's a matter of record by the Department of Statistics, that rates have increased faster than any of the other 186 components that make up the Consumer Price Index. They have gone up by a compound rate across New Zealand of 7% for every year since 2002. And that 7% per increase means that New Zealanders today, in this time of economic difficulty, are really struggling to pay their rates bills, and change is required. Now, if we look at the rate increase that occurred in the decade prior to Labour's reforms, it averaged just 3%. And I want to draw to the attention of the House the advice from the Department of Internal Affairs that if rate rises over the last decade had been what they were in the previous, the average Kiwi household would be paying $500 a year less in rates, and we as a country would be paying $1 billion a year less in rates. And so I challenge Labour and say your legacy of local government changes has been a huge expensive burden for households, for businesses, for farmers, and change was required. Now, Mr Speaker, the government announced in March a comprehensive package of reform to refocus the purpose of local government down to the infrastructure, the local public services and the regulatory functions that it can only be done by our councils. Equally so, we've strengthened the governance powers of what councils can do, including very significantly, requirement for councils to disclose not just the salaries of their CEOs, but the salaries of all their staff in their annual reports. That package of change changes the Local Government Act from 2002 and actually gives the power to our elected representatives, our mayors and councils, to not just have a say in the salary of their chief executive, but actually to set down a remuneration policy for all of the 23,000 staff that work across New Zealand's nearly 70 councils. That same package of reforms makes it easier for councils to be able to reorganise. It sets down improvements in the fiscal responsibility requirements of councils and is a far more comprehensive package of reform than this lightweight teeny-weeny little change that Labor has put on the agenda of the House this evening. There are a number of significant flaws in this bill. The first is that the member Annette King, who sponsored it, has said that it increases the openness and the transparency of the appointment of Chief Executive. It does no such thing. There is absolutely nothing in this bill that requires anything other than the State Services Commissioner to approve a contract between a council and Chief Executive. The member would well know, as an ex-Minister of State Services, how much transparency. Does that involve disclosure? In terms of when the government appoints CEOs, it makes not a dime of difference. If the member is interested in transparency in the salary of its chief executives, they would have voted for National's reform bill introduced to this House that very specifically requires disclosure of the salaries of not just the chief executive, but also in bands, as is required of public entities all the way through. It's a matter of record that Labor voted against that bill that provides for that increased level of transparency. And this is the real fraud with this bill. There are 23,000 employees of local government. Annette King somehow pretends that by making a change in the salaries or the way in which the contracts are drafted for just 68 of those 23,000 staff, that somehow it's going to make a difference to Ma and Pa's rates. We know that's not true. That's not real, Annette, and the member knows it. It is, as we have said, a flaky bill that is not dealing with the substance of the issues that face local government. It also is rather rich, because I checked on the speeches from Labor members when National introduced its local government reforms. And they had the audacity to say to this Parliament that National was treading all over the rights of councils. Well, that's a bit odd. I would say one of the most important decisions that a council makes is who it appoints as its chief executive and what it pays them, what's in the contract. Everybody who's practically involved in governance knows that appointment of your chief executive is one of the most important decisions, and now Labor is saying a council can't appoint a chief executive without getting the tick-off of central government, and if that's not a nanny state approach to councils, I really do not know what is there. And I have a challenge for the Labor members that are interjecting there, and it's this. Why would you impose a tighter control on councils appointing their chief executives than the vast bulk of state entities of which this House is responsible? What's the logic behind that? Why would you have the process by which a school board appoints its CEO or a district health board appoints its CEO? The controls that are imposed in this bill go significantly beyond that, and that has no rhyme nor reason. You see, the member says this bill arose out of the issue in Christchurch over the appointment of their chief executive. And the interesting thing is that when we appointed a Crown Observer, Labor criticised that. But it's interesting to note that it shows how slow Labor is, and it forgot to mention that actually the Chief Executive of Christchurch City has not taken that $68,000 pay increase, and this just shows how much behind the pace Labor is in terms of addressing the issues that are of concern to New Zealanders. Mr. Speaker, if we are to make local government more efficient, if we are to make local government more fiscally responsible, if we are to make them more transparent and accountable, then members of the public need to look to the sensible 8-point plan of reform that National has set down and is before the Select Committee. What we don't need is these small, flaky bills that pretend they are dealing with an issue. This really is about Labor playing catch-up. They've suddenly realised that they've made a hash of local government, that they've caught themselves on the side of big rates and big cost increases, and in a desperate attempt to play catch-up, they've introduced this puny bill, and it does not deserve the serious attention of the House.
I call Moana Maki.